feels like Play-Doh. It's just, this is completely dry. Okay, and it was glued in. Got it. And there's tape. You pay attention, Corsair. You take this and you melt it, and then you shape it into things that go on these little squares. This is the Corsair ONE i500. It's terrible, and Corsair's product page for the i500 calls it uncompromised for performance no fewer than 6 times. The page says uncompromised performance, lower down uncompromised performance, and then there's some more uncompromised performance, compact doesn't have to compromise, and a few more times uncompromised performance, which is a pretty easy thing to check against because if there's a compromise, it is not uncompromised. There's a compromise. It runs 600 megahertz below the expectation in all core workloads for the CPU. That's because it's not only intentionally power limited, but it is also thermally throttling, which those two together are the literal definition of compromise. In fact, there's no more literal definition of the word. In our view, Corsair is just straight up lying by calling this uncompromised when referring to its performance considering the size. It's actively compromising, and in Corsair's world, advanced top-tier cooling, those are direct quotes, means that GPU VRAM at 94 degrees Celsius and a 120mm radiator desperately trying but failing to keep the 14900K from hitting 100 degrees Celsius. We spent over $4,700 on this system, and that's because it was getting spammed everywhere. We've seen non-stop ads for it on social media, showcases and influencer videos, and putting it on display at large industry events. The Corsair ONE i500 seems awfully important for Corsair to try and sell, and so we bought one. We wanted to see how it is. Now, spoiler alert, it's bad. There are a few positives, like the software setup and... Well, anyway, let's review the Corsair ONE i500. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Antec C8 cases. We reviewed the Antec C8 ARGB a few months ago and found it to be an overall competitive performer using unique 160mm fans. There's also a version without included fans, and it's competitively priced while still offering attention to detail key elements like the airflow partition for better directing air intake. It also has high-quality kill management grommets and limited obstructions for bottom air intake. The ARGB variant includes all these features, but also 2 160mm reverse blade fans and one 140mm fan. Learn more at the link in the description below. The i500 is available in just 2 configurations. The 14900K is available in both of them, and so are the motherboard, cooling, power supply, and the custom case. Those are all shared between both configs. The difference is that ours has an RTX 4090 and it has 64 gigabytes of DDR5 6000. That's for $4,700 normally, or on sale if you want to really feel like you're getting a deal, for $4,200. We did some price analysis using identical DIY parts wherever possible, or replacements where not. It's not our goal to choose better parts. We just want to see what's the price come out to if we choose the same ones. So we're not trying to outmatch them. We want a fair fight. The i500 ends up with a premium of $1,625 over DIY, or $1,225 if counting the current sale, which in either of those two situations is completely insane. Over the last couple of years, we've reviewed PCs that were on the higher side of markup, like the Starforge PCs and one of Main Gear's. But even in those situations, that higher side is more like $450 to $550, maybe $650 extra if you buy something like custom color on the case. Before even getting into the terrible thermals, the weird power behavior, and just the general incompetence of some of the component selection though, we can look at the basics, like the B760 chipset motherboard, or the inadequate 120mm CPU liquid cooler, the capacity of the SSD, 4TB M.2 options start retail around $220, including Corsair's own MP600 Core XT 4TB for $260. And yet on this one, we're spending $4,700 and getting 2 terabytes. It doesn't come with any peripherals, but Corsair is happy to link its $280 K100 Air wireless keyboard prominently on the products page. Not coming with peripherals is fine, but we were just trying to find literally anywhere for that extra money to make sense. The case itself is custom, and it's exclusive to the i500. So if we look at it, it has a solid front, which comes in dark wood, which we have, sourced from walnut, light wood, sourced from maple, or black metal, presumably sourced from Norway. And I know the origins of different types of metal. I mean, obviously. There are these sort of floppy panels with dust filters on them using fabric. There's the large steel panels underneath those. And then on top, which I've already unscrewed, is this big chunky piece of metal that is almost a heat sink, but not quite connected the way it could have been. Would have been really cool to see though, if they had followed through on the design. So the top and the bottom both have bulky aluminum fins. The top gets warm during operation, but the metal isn't leveraged directly for cooling the way it should be. It's a missed opportunity, especially in such a customized build. The bottom has holes to theoretically let the power supply access air, but it's so blocked off that there's only a few millimeters of space for it to breathe, so the vents are functionally useless or very close to it. This is bad, and the case should absolutely not be placed on carpet. All the fans in the i500 are Corsair AF120 Slims that top out at 2,000 RPM and are all stacked up right against the side. It's a unique ensemble. Slim fans typically struggle in high resistance applications, like on radiators. The left side fans are entirely intake, and the right side, as typical, has no fans and no real opportunity for airflow. But it's those slims on the radiators that are problematic. The i500's main cooling is handled by two independent closed-loop liquid coolers, 120 on the CPU and a 240 on the GPU as exhaust with the CPU's intake. And the CPU cooler is laughable for the notoriously hot 14900K that it's attached to. As for the GPU cooler, it should be able to handle its job, given no major screw-ups. Unfortunately for Corsair, there are major screw-ups. Let's get into the charts. Here's the chart of GPU thermals for the Corsair ONE at already steady state under various loads. GPU thermals are abysmal. The water-cooled Corsair 4090 has a GPU VRAM hitting 94 degrees Celsius into 21C ambient, which is completely unacceptable, even if it were air-cooled. TJ Maxx for VRAM, depending on special exclusions and exceptions provided by the actual manufacturer of it, is typically 95C or 105C. Depends on the specific memory. In either scenario, the 94C result is deeply concerning and embarrassing for Corsair to even ship out the door with water attached to the block that shares a cold plate with the memory. We added the Asus Strix 4090 in here just for a high-end air cooler reference and used its stock fan curve. Testing is on an open bench. It's not perfectly controlled because it doesn't matter. It's not supposed to be. The point is just a reference. The i500's 4090 is warmer across the board, even with liquid cooling. GPU core is way higher on the i500's 4090, and the solution is louder. It's 70 degrees versus 63.7. Back when we reviewed the colorful Neptune 4090, its core temperature was about 52C in the same test, albeit with a different liquid cooler. It gives us an idea for what's more expected. Corsair's 4090 thermals are disastrous. Now, related to all of this, thermal interface material, including thermal pads, like the crusty ones here, they age. Dust accumulates if you have it in actual use, and liquid permeates tubes in the liquid coolers with time, which will reduce their efficacy. And 94C can easily breach 100 degrees Celsius with a little bit of time in the mix, or even just a higher local ambient temperature, which we know a lot of you have. Liquid temperature inside the GPU loop hits 65 degrees Celsius for the i500. For reference, some closed-loop liquid cooler manufacturers, including Asetek, cite 60 to 65C as being the maximum safe liquid temperature for the plastics internal to the pump before they start breaking down. This chart shows all system thermals at steady state. We already talked about GPU thermals being not only uncompetitive, but embarrassingly bad and potentially damaging to long-term survivability of some of the components. So the CPU is next. During a Cinebench workload and at steady state, the P cores averaged 89 degrees Celsius. The hottest single cores were hitting 100 degrees Celsius, only stopping there because they were thermal throttling and hitting TJ Maxx. This is, again, literally a compromise, despite what we believe is Corsair's false advertising. With Blender, which is a completely realistic all-core workload, we still monitored 81 degree results on P cores and 92 for the hottest single core. VR VCC also measured hot, all the way up at 85 degrees Celsius. The MOSFET temperatures from the motherboard that were logged in software measured 79 degrees, which is warm, but survivable. Capacitor temperature would matter here as well. We didn't check that because our conclusion is already that you shouldn't buy this. The PCH was fine, SPD hub on the RAM was fine, and the drive was also fine. But the components that matter, the CPU and the GPU, were not fine. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the way the GPU cooling is set up on this system, also just the cooling in general. But we'll focus on the GPU first since the VRAM is so bad. A large portion of the issue is that, bizarrely, the rear fan on the GPU radiator, so there's two fans on the GPU rad, the backmost one is actually controlled by the CPU cooler liquid temperature. It barely did anything during a GPU heavy load, like gaming where you're on the GPU mostly in say a 4K scenario. And the end result of that is in a gaming scenario, typically you're either gonna be heavily CPU or GPU bound. It is very uncommon for a full torch or both component workload to happen in gaming. It's almost always gonna be one or the other. And so it's almost always gonna be the case that the fans on one component should ramp more than the other. This is better for noise and for thermals. In this situation, we've got one fan doing effectively fuck all for the GPU, which is the part that really needs it right now. Now, you also can't change this fan behavior. And if that sounds stupid, it's because it is. This alone doesn't explain the 94 degrees Celsius VRAM, so we'll look around for a root cause in the teardown. And let's jump over to the teardown for that. Okay, now we're gonna tear it apart. So this is where I think we might actually discover some of the problems. First of all, the floppy panels can come off, and we're just gonna pull these large metal side panels off. For this, currently working on top of a GN silicone soldering and project mat, which is on top of one of our mod mats on store.gamersnexus.net. First unveil. All right, so first of all, the door swings out like this. This is a nice mechanism, but I'm getting kind of Alienware vibes in some ways. The tubes are incredibly short. This is custom, or at least specially selected for this configuration. A much too small radiator that we'll talk about elsewhere in the review. No idea why they would use a 120 for a 14900K, but we get to see the results of that, as you probably saw in the intro of this video. So as a mechanism, the door is nice. It's just, it's exactly like the Alienware situation where it's kind of like we're spending the effort on cool things in the wrong places, where the effort for cool things should be spent on cooling things for this case. I have not taken this apart before, by the way. No one on the team has. Jeremy opened the fan door and that was it. That screw's gone forever. They've got a clip that's adhesive to the top of the power supply. You can see the quality of the adhesive though. So, but anyway, it was a nice touch. There's more clips here. They didn't mold cable tie points into the metal, even though they control every aspect of this case. That's kind of strange. Getting a little closer to the problem area, which is the GPU, but I want to get this door off first. All right, now we're gonna pull the cooler out. That one's loose. So this is where it was. And let's just see how loose this one is. Got almost 3/4 of a turn. That one was very loose. That was okay. That one's also pretty loose. Okay, well, so they could have done better on that. Just another Asmongold screw guy situation. Screw guy was fired from Starforge, now he works at Corsair. These cap screws are massive, by the way. I do actually kind of like these. Okay. So this was a pre-applied screen. You can see the silk screen markers on the edges where they wipe past it. That's totally fine. That standardizes it. We're completely okay with that. Let me quote Adam Savage here. There's your problem. So in this video, we're gonna be talking about the memory, which is under the copper plate, hitting something like 90 degrees Celsius, actually approaching 100, which is bad, but also the VRM has nothing connected to it. We haven't done any disassembly on the card yet. All I did was take out the plate with a fan on it, and the VRM is just completely exposed. It's air cooling only with no contact to an actual heatsink. Possible to keep it cool if the VRM is stupid overbuilt, but a really bad approach to it. So it is a 3-slot bracket, which is nice if you were supporting like a large air cooler or something. But unfortunately, once again, the nice feature is in the wrong place. What an awful approach. This is like actually one of the worst approaches I've seen to a liquid-cooled pre-built card. There's absolutely no contact to anything on the VRM. There's actually 2 blanks for 8 pins, so they're reusing this PCB from some other design. Be curious to see if there's even a thermal pad between the PCB and the backplate. So what went wrong here? So this is some of the problem. This corner on this memory module had 0 contact to a thermal pad. You can see that there's no residue left, and on the pad there's no impression of it, so that's not great. There's kind of poor contact around the edges over here and here. There's poor contact actually on this entire third of these two units. And then this one has poor contact up in this corner here. And I know that by looking at the residue pattern, which we can double confirm by looking at the cold plate. So the way these work, it is good when it works. And the way it's supposed to work is the copper cold plate is shared with the memory and the GPU. So the downside of this approach is that the GPU appears to run a little bit warmer because the liquid's warmer because they're sharing a cooling solution. The copper's warmer, so everything's a little warmer. But the upside of it is that the memory has access to much better cooling because it's attached to the cold plate that eventually feeds microfins into the pump itself, the pump block itself, which is where it ends up cooling. So that's the good and the bad of it. Unfortunately, this situation just didn't work at all. Based on our testing, these pads, despite being a little crusty, are pretty standard. They are thicker, though, and thicker thermal pads is going to hurt performance. I think most of the problem is just in the contact patterns. So, I don't know. Maybe that's not most of the problem. This is like, I mean, it feels like Play-Doh. It's just, this is completely dry. I'm not sure how good of a conductor that is. Look at that. There's definitely problems with the contact on some of these, but I think also, and ultimately it's like a 240 up here that's handling all this, and there's a lot of heat for a 240 to deal with, just like it was a lot of heat for a 120 to deal with the CPU, and because they're syncing it all into the same thing, I mean, there's not a ton of capacity left over to handle the memory in addition to the GPU core itself. I'm really disappointed with the GPU solution, and I'm honestly just baffled on how bare bones and cheap this is. So, very strange. Okay, we're gonna pull the rest of this apart now. The cables, so far all of them are seated fully. Jesus. That one was really seated. We're gonna pull the screws, I think. This screw is just completely loose and is basically free floating in there before I ever touched it. You know, every now and then people are like, yeah, shipping. Shipping can do a little bit. What it can't do is process error across multiple screws, so that's what we look for. All right, so that's 4 of these that were pretty loose. And by pretty loose, I mean like, there's a decent chance they come out on their own. This is kind of not great to get to either, the EPS cables. But I don't know, I'm taking the approach, I'm only doing 1 trip in from the car after I buy groceries. That's what this is right now. That is the success of a person who cuts off the circulation of his fingers to carry all the grocery bags in 1 trip. Some cable ties here for managing the cables on the back. This is a nice touch. The cable ties, they've flattened out, like splayed and flattened these cables. So that's good. It's not all terrible. But enough of it is that you shouldn't buy it, but it's not all terrible. DDR5 6000, 3036, 3676. CPU, standard paste pattern, looks fine. So the last thing to do here is inspect what appears to be a SATA centipede. What the fuck? look at this barrel. Oh, is this for the cooler? So there's the USB 2 header. That goes to the pump. Where does this go? Torx, by the way, for the power supply. Man, this is so incredibly annoying. Let's just hope there's no problems with this. That seems pretty easy to get right. Okay, so they've got these massive screwed in like steel plates. See the hat? They've got these secured to hold the cables in place. This is so, like, I need to know if the guy who made the Alienware case quit and went to Corsair. Does this go to I/O? This goes to the I/O. Clamping cables in, under which the power supply cables were routed. Okay, and it was glued in. got it. And there's tape. This is such a hack. This is like a complete hack job. Okay. What the fuck? Why? Okay. Why would you do this? You pay attention, Corsair. You take this and you melt it, and then you shape it into things that go on these little squares. This case has been really frustrating to work in. I know, like, the idea is you don't take it apart, but some level of serviceability is nice, and they don't really hit those marks here. I mean, more plastic adhesive cable ties where they, if you're custom building a whole damn case for the machine, then you can at least get in cable tie points and not use these pieces of adhesive that just dry up because it's 100 degrees in there all the time. So, okay, I've had enough of the teardown. We're gonna go to the next part of the video. Back to charts. For GPU clock, the RTX 4090 and the Corsair ONE i500 initially boost to 2655 MHz before falling to an average of 2620. It frequently drops to 2580 in testing. Our air-cooled 4090s typically stay relatively flat and higher than this. Looking now at CPU power behavior, CPU package power shows the CPU hitting the 240 watt PL2 limit during the passes until tau expires and drops power to the lower 200 watt PL1 that Corsair set. There's still a momentary higher peak at the beginning of every pass, which lines up with the thermals. Normally, for the 14900K under Intel Performance or Extreme profiles, there's no time limit on PL2, and PL1 would equal PL2, rendering tau meaningless anyway. Here, they're forced to use it because the cooler is woefully insufficient. To look at CPU frequency, we're comparing our original 14900K review data for an all-core 3D rendering workload in Blender against the Corsair build. The original review data had an average frequency of 5321 MHz P-core and over 4600 MHz all-core. The Corsair ONE was already 300 MHz below this for P-core at 5031 MHz. And so it is once again compromising. The problem is that even this only persists for a minute or two, at which point it falls to the 4689 MHz entry that we're seeing. That's what you'd see in the vast majority of use cases that extend more than a minute or two. That is a massive 632 MHz across all P-core drop to a combination of compromises and poor design. 632 MHz against every P-core will have a multiplicative effect where the performance loss cascades. Before moving to BIOS, we'll look at the airflow situation. We made this custom 3D animation to help visualize the airflow patterns that we observed during testing. First, the side panels themselves already present a lot of challenges for the fans. The plastic and metal supports block a lot of the intake area, meaning that those areas for the fans will be dead. They won't be able to do anything. They can't pull air through plastic. 3 fans are revealed from removing the left panel. Some of them are on a hinging mechanism that we actually liked, if not for all the other problems. It's a good way to get side intake without the panel itself being tethered to a cable. Opening the hinged door reveals the top exhaust fans mounted to the GPU radiator with 1 fan attached to CPU liquid temperature. Closing the doors again, here's how the air is flowing. This case will mostly behave in a positive pressure way. The bottom fan blows air in unobstructed. The fan directly above it pulls only past the panel and pushes basically straight into the rightmost GPU radiator fan. The fan to its left pushes air in, through a radiator, and then it mostly gets pulled up and out. Opening the bottom fan hinge, this air will mostly hit the exposed GPU components. Because the upper half of the chassis is sectioned off by the card, and because there's a solid steel plate next to it, most of the air finds its way out through the rear PCIe slot covers. There's a ton of heat in this area from the PCB and GPU, and no active way to get rid of it. Plus, the card is dividing the case, so a lot of that heat will get trapped and just kind of sit there. We think this contributes to a lot of the problems. As for the upper half, the biggest challenge is for the CPU radiator. The rightmost fan will push more air straight into the chassis than the radiator fan next to it, which will struggle with resistance and pressure. The rightmost fan is mostly going to feed the GPU exhaust, while the left fan will push warmed CPU air in straight into the VRM, and then it'll go mostly out the radiator for the GPU. The rear port is empty, but it's ventilated, and depending on the speed of the various fans, it can function either as sort of a passive intake when the system is exhausting more than it's bringing in, or as an exhaust if it's forcing a lot of air in through the top 2 fans on the left side. To support more of these educational animations, visit store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our Mule Mugs, 3D PC part coaster packs, or soldering in project mats. Anyway, let's move on to BIOS to inspect all this. Corsair's motherboard is the MSI MAG, which stands for MSI, whatever AG stands for. The G's probably gaming. B760M Mortar Wi-Fi, but with a proprietary BIOS that turns it into the Mortar Wi-Fi Corsair. We occasionally see this from the larger SIs, and we always consider it a bad thing, as it forces reliance on the SI for updates, rather than the motherboard manufacturer, which is more reliable. The board's BIOS has a build date of February 2nd, 2024, and there weren't any updated versions on Corsair's download page until September 9th. That means Corsair didn't take any action to support its customers with new microcode revisions in the face of Intel CPU stability and degradation issues until after MSI itself did. In other words, if Corsair had just used an off-the-shelf board, customers could get normal updates sooner. Some BIOS settings are good, MSI's software download tool is disabled, XMP is applied, and almost all CPU values were defaults except the power limits, so that's mostly good. PL1 was set to 200 watts, PL2 to 240, and ICC max at 350 amps. Both power limits are lower than Intel's notorious June recommendations for the 14900K under the performance and extreme profiles. All these values in BIOS are also totally locked and unable to be changed by the user. This is both an admission of the subpar cooling capabilities and a hindrance in any scenario where the user might want something else. BIOS also lacks any way to control the fans. Only CPU1 is shown, but this is actually one of the CLC pumps. None of the 5 actual fans are attached to the motherboard itself, and therefore can't be controlled here. On to packaging. The i500's packaging was good, with dual layer boxes and thick tofu-like foam that probably has the word eco in the name somewhere. Large, clear unpacking instructions were immediately on top of the box after opening the outer box. We liked how well it was secured, at least. The only accessories included were the wireless antenna, and that's it. No peripherals, which again is fine. It's probably just waste anyway most of the time, but we would have liked something to make up for that money. No headphone hanger, which oddly was shown in a lot of the influencer videos that we saw, and no extra power supply cables. This one is a big negative, especially since the SF1000L power supply inside is a standard part and should remain operational well beyond the useful life of the system as a whole. There also weren't any manuals, nor was there a sticker covering the motherboard's display connectors to help guide novice users in the right direction. And those are the users who will need it because they're the only people who would buy this. There's just the most basic setup instructions on the unpacking card and a link to Corsair's online quick start guide. We were surprised by the inclusion of genuinely useful instructions for hardware upgrades. RAM, M.2, and 2.5-inch SSDs, and an extra PCIe card all get detailed. Another positive, for something that you shouldn't buy anyway, was the i500's operating system setup and software. The Windows 11 out-of-box experience went as expected, and we had 0 pop-ups on first boot. The only actively running non-Windows software was the Corsair ONE dashboard. It's a bare-bones utility for changing the case lighting and monitoring liquid temperatures and fan speeds. However, it can't change the fan speeds. It doesn't even remember your RGB settings all the time. We don't know why, it just seems to forget them. We think it's strange that Corsair didn't go with the more mature software solution like iCUE here. The only other bloatware on the system is the Corsair Diagnostics software, a suite of tools from Ultra X for reading system stats, a variety of stress tests. Now, as another positive, there weren't any missing drivers in Device Manager. We have seen companies miss drivers before. StarForge did it recently, despite Windows picking up what they missed. But the NVIDIA Game Ready driver was 3 months out of date by the time we bought the system, meaning that the image was built and/or the system was sitting around for 3 months without any updates prior to a customer purchasing it. We think that's too long of a window. The final test is noise testing over time in our hemi-anechoic chamber, only made possible by the long-term support both on Patreon from you all and the GN store. So thanks to everyone who's helped us out with this by subscribing to us on Patreon at patreon.com/gamersnexus, or by buying stuff like our solder mats, which are now available in red, green, yellow, and the original blue, plus our large PC building anti-static mod mats. Since we can't directly control or log the fan RPM on the i500, we have to rely on noise data gathered over time during a full system torture test. Here's the chart. The system is very quiet at idle and during initial periods of load. It hovers around 17 dBA before briefly rising to about 18 dBA at our noise floor of around 14 or so for this test. The noise ramps rapidly after this during a period of about 100 seconds, reaching 33 dBA, and then it steadily increases to settle at an average of 37.7. This behavior is due to the fans being set to react to liquid temperature inside the CLCs rather than the actual component load or heat. That can work, but the downside is that there's a fan curve that's steep. And it boils down to basically two modes of operation: slow with hot thermals and relatively quiet, or fast with hot thermals and loud. Here are a few noise samples of it. Now, the 2000 RPM fans keep this from sounding crazy, but the approach is devoid of any nuance, any skill, and it lacks competent configuration. It seems kind of like the auto approach to cooling for something that otherwise was supposed to be custom, which is bizarre. Corsair wanted the i500 to be perceived as silent under load, but it's only quiet as long as the load is sporadic, with heat spikes being absorbed by liquid. Anything that's sustained for more than a minute or two, it'll start to get loud. The conclusion's pretty easy: don't buy it. That's the conclusion. Now, I really want my money back, but I have it now, so put the case on a shelf or melt it down or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's not worth buying. The price is steep. The value is bad. If we ignore all the problems, right? Like, that's what's crazy about this build. It's so bad that we can actually ignore every single objective problem. Thermals, acoustics, hysteresis, whatever. It doesn't matter. Forget all of it. It's still a $1,625 or on sale $1,225 increase in price over DIY. And while we don't think everyone should build a computer themselves, that's still too much, because you can go to other SIs and get similar form factor systems for less of a ripoff, which is all this is. Plus, it's not even designed well. It doesn't make any sense. So it's a situation where we are fully on board with pre-builts being a thing. It makes total sense. There are people who can't or don't want to build their own computers. They don't have time. They're concerned to do it, want maybe a consolidated warranty, guaranteed support, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. There's a lot of valid reasons to buy a pre-built. That's why we review them. So that's not the problem. It's just the price. That's the problem. The B760 board at this price is an absolute joke. The SSD should be larger in the very least to just not insult us so much with that price. GPU VRAM at 94 degrees Celsius is literally insane. I don't know, maybe if they didn't use like crusty thermal pads from the bottom of the grease fryer at a McDonald's, it might have actually been okay. But the solution they've built here for the GPU is woefully inept. It is either the biggest cost-cutting solution in the greediest way possible, which is my cover band name for Corsair at this point, or it's incompetent, because they don't have anything on any of the VRM components. And while, yes, some MOSFETs can run at such a high temperature without issue that you can go heat sinkless, in this situation, we are already blasting the memory. And our friend Der Bauer, who looked at this system a couple months ago, he spotted thermal issues as well. I don't thoroughly look through other people's reviews until we complete the writing process of our own, but now that we're at the conclusion of this, went and checked to see what he had to say, and he had a lot of similar complaints. We found some unique problems beyond what he found, but he certainly found enough to make the conclusion we're making here, which is that this is insane to buy. Anyway, the other problems include limited CPU cooling. A 14900K is a terrible selection for this. A 240 CLC could have easily fit instead if Corsair made its custom case a few millimeters larger. Alternatively, Corsair could be realistic, swallow its pride, and use a lower tier CPU like it did in the past, instead of just putting one with a bigger number in it and then downclocking it to effectively be a lower tier CPU anyway. The user can't even change the fan settings at all without totally rewiring them to run straight to the motherboard. The power supply barely has access to air, it's bare on accessories, it doesn't have any of the extra cables, and on the bright side, the online documentation is good and Windows setup was mostly clean. So the conclusion is pretty simple. When you're paying $5 grand for a computer, if it's going to be marked up as much as this one is, it needs to at least perform at the expected performance. It needs to at least hit the spec of the parts they're putting in it. Because putting a 14900K in here and then smothering it to the extent that it becomes basically an i7 or something, it is not only unfair to the user, but when you put the phrase uncompromised performance, which has a very specific meaning all over the webpage marketing this, we think that is false advertising. I mean, I have a really strong stance on this. Uncompromised performance has literally one meaning. It means performance without compromises, which this has. That's why we made such a big deal about it at the beginning. So Corsair's, obviously you can't trust their marketing at this point because that is unbelievably misleading to the extent of being a lie. So that's it. That's a review of the Corsair ONE i500. I am exceptionally disappointed and my day is ruined for about 30 seconds. Then I'll be fine again because we've posted actually a lot of positive reviews lately of things that don't suck. So if you want to see something positive, we've got 3 videos that have gone up from the last week that are really good. This, unfortunately, is not one of those. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Throw a few bucks our way every month so that we can keep buying machines like this to do in-depth reviews and analysis. And we'll see you all next time.